Finally, if you look at gender equality, women are moving up in terms of pay, but in the UK, the difference between the men and women is still pretty high. It's still pretty high with other European countries in terms of how many women actually enter to the workforce. A lot of UK women still sit at home and don't enter the workforce. So that was the UK. Um, let's move on to Sweden, which is going to be something of a contrast. I would have to say, within the European context, the UK kind of being there somewhere in the middle between US and Sweden. But in terms of how laissez-faire it is, it's pretty much most laissez-faire country in the Western Europe. That's what we are talking about UK. Now Sweden, it's not. It's not laissez-faire. All right. Sweden has a history of Keynesianism. The Great Depression of 1930 is not just the UK entered into Keynesianism with the New Deal, but Sweden really uh, entered into this. And as we have talked about before, it has a real strong commitment to full employment. It's okay for them to spend a lot of money, employ a lot of people in the government, and they, until the 1990s, never had an unemployment above 3.5%. That would mean sometimes that some of these public agencies were bloated with civil servants who were getting money even if those agencies weren't efficient. Hmm. But the point was that they really wanted everybody to have job. That's their first and foremost goal. One of the other ways that they try to ensure that everybody has a job is with what they call an active labor market policy. And an active labor market policy simply means you don't get to sit on your couch. Well, actually, you do get to sit on your couch in Sweden, but what they really encourage you to do is to give more benefits, almost full benefits if you actually get off your duff and go and get employment training. To get the unemployed train, they have this training. So that's the way that works. Now let's talk about the public-private divide. This means how much they have inserted themselves into economy. One measure of this is that a very high percentage of population, one third of the population, about 35% of population are employed by the government. They they have a government jobs, cushy jobs, as we would like to say. I mean, um, 35% compared to UK's 24%. Government less involved, less government jobs, and the UK far lower, 70%. Um, in this economy, government is less involved, only about half the rate of what we see in Sweden. Just to put that into context, again, I just want to make a point right now that if you are writing a paper in this class or any other class, don't always just cite numbers. Don't just say this country spent 300 billions or 20% of population is poor. That doesn't tell us very much unless you provide some context. So it might be good to always compare it in some situation that the readers might know as such what is unemployment like in the US, or is 200 billion a large part of the total economy. Always try to put information in context. It means a lot more that way. If you say that US, oh, oh my gosh, you have 3.5 or 3.8% unemployment, that's great. 3.8 unemployment is great. Do you know it's would rather have 3.8% unemployment than 2% unemployment. Because if you have 2% unemployment, it means that businesses are not finding enough workers. But unless you understand the full context, the proper context of numbers, they are kind of useless when they stand on their own. So, however, despite the fact that a lot of people are state employees, the government doesn't own, coming back to the Sweden situation, um, we see that, you know, even though people are employed a lot by the government, they doesn't own a lot of companies. It's not like communist states where all these businesses are owned by the government. So the banks, the insurance companies, there is a system called system below, such as a monopoly controlling the same sale of wine, liquor, and strong beer, kind of like beer store up in Canada. Do you ever been up there in Canada? You will see that those things are owned by the government, but that only constitutes about 10% of the total economy. I would say maybe 5% of the total economy. The private economy is 95% of the economy. But nevertheless, what we do see is Sweden spends a lot of money, as lot of expenditure, and government is quite involved, and lot of its neighbors in Europe are not quite as generous, and that kind of puts Sweden a little bit at a disadvantage. Its businesses have to pay a higher tax. Government might be in great debt, and so Sweden has started to reform. It started to change its laws. Eventually, the SAP, the big Social Democratic Party, has lowered its taxes to make sure to put the onus on individuals. Individuals now can take more money home, and it's up to them to save money. If they want, they can spend it on beer, or but they could spend it on saving, and seems to have more safe for retirement if they want to. But simply they lower the taxes, kind of like in the case of US. We are we were worried about the business abroad, and or that no one invests in US because they would say the rate of taxation is too high. It's one of the argument why there has been a drastic reduction in capital gains and that kind of taxes on business in the US. The Swedish did the same, exact same thing, and they started lowering their expenditure on welfare state by 1980s or so. Sweden was not an initial member of EU. There were six initial members back in the late 1950s, and by 1970s, the UK joined. Sweden didn't join the EU until the 1990s, far later. Part of this has to do with its desire to remain neutral, but another reason why they wanted to join the EU is that they kind of said this would be our way for forcing ourselves to become more competitive. If we join the EU, then we can't have trade barriers between us and the European countries, and those other European countries are going to um, way out compete us because we have such high taxes. We tax our businesses so heavily. So it was going to be a way to start deregulating a little bit. Well, catch on to the economic growth of overall EU, and in exchange, we will be giving up a little bit of control over our domestic economy. We will have to do away with some regulation because the EU will farm many countries meant reducing regulations, reducing certain kinds of laws um, um, that regulated the economy. So to become more laissez-faire, that's one of the reasons why Sweden joined. Now, Swedish growth in the in the UK, to put it in context, is um, below average, but its inflation is very low and its unemployment is very low as well. So we have to say it's got an healthy economy. If you just want to measure the GDP growth, yeah, it's pretty low compared to UK, but other important measures to the individuals are going to be, you know, how do I make roughly the same as other people? Yes, they have very low income inequality. Do things cost roughly the same this year as next year? Yes, right, the inflation is very low. And I have a job. Unemployment is low in Sweden. So yes, not a fast grower, and that's why as an outsider, it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't want to invest in a Swedish business. Your returns are going to be very low. They don't make that much revenue. But to be a Swedish citizen, it's a good thing. Now, another thing which differentiates Sweden very strongly from the UK is the idea of democratic corporatism, um, which simply means that the peak level organizations work together with government to draft up policies um, and implement policies. They do so by they've got a state commission where they advise the cabinet, again the leading ministers of the country. They get advised by this commission, which consists of experts from various interest groups, unions, and employers, political parties, employers association, and different kinds of agencies. Another way to show how open the government is, they got a process called REMIS, which simply means that ministerial departments like business, like defense ministry or education ministry, invites comment from interest group, say send us your comments and we will integrate them. Come back, we will talk to you about this, and things like that. The government has also created national labor market boards, and this simply to organize the corporatism that exists between the employers association and the union. That they meet together. Again, government will subsidize um, those businesses and employ the young or the handicapped. To make that happen, businesses and union have to meet together to sign certain agreement, but they are not encouraged to do so. The government says, listen, we will make it worth your while business if you are a business that subsidizes also some of the less employable members like young and handicapped. We will further your business. That makes it easier for the union and employers to an agreement. So every year, LO and SAF write this in the union and these employers organizations, and they negotiate together in a huge meeting where they set up an annual agreements. This has changed somewhat. We have seen with the differences becoming larger in the different industries. Now the actual agreements are much more decentralized. Now not just one national agreement, but individual industries, to say that car industry versus high tech industry versus teaching versus public transport. So you will have different agreements, but they are still industry wide. But which we all call collective bargaining. Another thing that demonstrate that democratic corporatism has ensured that comparing by competing with other countries, industrial relations remain between the workers and employers are fairly peaceful. One key example there is during the 1960s, less than 18 times a year you saw strikes. The US saw about 5,000 strikes, a lot more industrial unrest than in Sweden in 1960s. So, in closing,